Hello and welcome to the Myers-Briggs podcast, a show where every other Wednesday I'll talk about the Myers-Briggs personality types in a new way that is easy to understand so you can improve your relationships with the people around you and also yourself by learning why we are exactly the way we are. I'm your host Isaac, and today we're going to talk about the dichotomy of each of the 4 letters that make up the 16 MBTI types. So, what's a dichotomy? I'm pretty sure that my first exposure to the word dichotomy was actually when I first started learning about MBTI, so I thought it made sense to actually define it here in the podcast too before diving all the way into it. The official Oxford Languages definition is, quote, a division or contrast between two things that are or are represented as being opposed or entirely different. Each MBTI type is made up of 4 letters total, and for each position, you have a total of 2 possible letter choices, which is why it's a dichotomy. So the first letter will be I or E for introversion or extroversion. The second letter will be S or N for sensing or intuition. The third will be T or F for thinking or feeling. And lastly, the fourth letter will be J or P for judging or perceiving. So in this episode, we'll talk in detail about both possibilities for all 4 letter placements. A lot of MBTI analysts or typologists will not use the 4-letter dichotomy for typing people, and instead favor typing people by something called the cognitive functions, as described by Carl Jung in his book Psychological Types, published in 1921. Generally, I do tend to fall into that camp as well, as I think it offers a more nuanced view and description of each of the 16 types of cognitive processes. But we'll talk all about the cognitive functions in future episodes. For now, we're just going to focus on the later contributions of Isabel Briggs Myers and her mother, Catherine Cook Briggs, who took Jung's cognitive functions and used them to develop the 16 types from the 4-letter dichotomy, which is all the types that we know about today. With all of that said, even though I like Jung's cognitive functions better, I wouldn't make an episode all about the 4-letter dichotomy if I didn't think it held some kind of value, because otherwise I'd just be wasting my time and yours, and I'm not here to do that. Some people might decide that the 4-letter dichotomy just makes more sense, or it's easier to understand, and they just tend to have more fun using MBTI in simpler terms, and that's totally okay. If you listen to this one episode to learn about the dichotomy and decide, okay, sounds good, I feel no need to dive any deeper than that, that is 100% fine by me, and I'm just glad that you stuck around for the episode. At the end of the day, this podcast is a resource for understanding yourself and others, so if learning about the dichotomy satisfies that for you, then I'm happy for you. So now that we have a bit of background on the topic for the episode, let's talk about the actual letters in the 4-letter dichotomy. I mentioned earlier that the first letter will either be an I or an E, which stands for introverted or extroverted respectively. This is probably the most well-known dichotomy, as people will often talk about the difference between the two outside of the scope of MBTI 2. Another place you may have heard of extroversion versus introversion might be the most researched and scientifically validated personality assessment called the Big 5 personality assessment. Similar to the Big 5, your leaning towards either side of any of the 4 dichotomies in MBTI is often represented as a spectrum. It's important to remember that nobody is really 100% true extrovert or introvert, same as any of the other MBTI dichotomies. We are all more complicated than that. With that note out of the way, let's talk about what extroversion and introversion actually are, since I do know there are still people out there who haven't given it much thought, or do not have the most accurate sense for what it actually means to be either of these things, so I think it's still worth going into. Extroverts are people who naturally gain energy from socializing with other people on a regular basis. This includes friends and family, but oftentimes even extends to coworkers, colleagues, or potentially just randos at the store, like a friendly cashier or something. If extroverts go too long without socializing, they can become stir crazy for feeling too cooped up alone, or they can become depressed and lonely much quicker than their introverted counterparts. Still, even extroverts need alone time sometimes to unwind and self reflect, and enjoying social interaction and community does not make them shallow, as they are sometimes incorrectly perceived to be. They just prefer going out and interacting with other people in the world more often than not. If you don't already know, I'm an introvert, which is the other one. Introverts naturally gain energy from spending time alone and doing solitary activities. Introverts still love their friends and family and don't harbor any ill will against strangers, unless they're the kind of introverts to be like, I hate small talk, it's so fake, talk to me about the universe. But that isn't really an introvert problem so much as it is an arrogance problem to think that small talk has no place in the world. It's the polite thing to do, and small talk generally doesn't last much longer than a few minutes anyway. But still, extroverts do have a bit of an advantage with small talk because it does energize them, and it does tend to drain introverts over longer periods of time. You'll often hear introverts talking about needing to recharge from social events, which often entails going home, spending time alone, doing whatever kind of personal rituals help them reestablish their inner balance. This can be something simple like reading or watching TV, or more involved solitary hobbies like creating art or exercising, or just anything you can do by yourself, really. That's the most important part. It's going to look different for everybody, so if you've got an important introvert in your life, just try to learn about what their preferred recharge methods are and give them the necessary time to make it happen. And if you've got an important extrovert in your life, make sure they get out, make sure they see those people they've been missing, or go to those places they've been meaning to get to, because you don't want them to be stir crazy, just like you don't want introverts to be overwhelmed and overstimulated. The second letter can either be S or N, which is short for sensing or intuition. And yeah, intuition starts with an I, but we already used I for introvert, so we have to use N. Oh well. This dichotomy is probably the least understood, which I remember struggling with when I first learned about MBTI, although now I can't really remember what the problem was because I've understood the difference for so long now, so go figure. Your sensing or intuition is how you prefer to absorb information from the outside world that you can later use for decision making. Sensors tend to lean more towards practicality and detail-oriented information processing, while intuitives lean more towards abstract, big-picture ideas. I would say that this particular dichotomy suffers the most in terms of accuracy and precision in their descriptions, without the deeper explanations offered by the Jungian cognitive functions, but again, we'll cover that next time. Whether it's the here and now or in the past, sensors most naturally consider using information that is readily available, observable, and attainable by everybody. It can be things you observe in the present moment, or step-by-step instructions, or recorded history, or a retrospective review of data or something. Sensors perceive things in a very concrete, practical, applicable, what you see is what you get kind of information. Because this dichotomy is often so misunderstood, and also introduces a lot of bias for one over the other, but that's for another episode, I'm trying to include as many keywords to accurately describe each side to create as full of a picture as I possibly can. Intuitives, on the other hand, are all about big picture, abstract pattern recognition, not tangible details like sensors. They perceive things as what could be instead of what is, or what something symbolizes instead of what it looks like on the outside. They see the potential for something to shift and change into something else later, and want to act based on that information instead of what is right in front of them. If all of that sounds kind of vague and intangible, that's because it kind of is. I mentioned that this dichotomy is the least understood when people start learning about MBTI, but I also think that this is also the hardest dichotomy for lay people who don't study MBTI to relate to when they meet another person of the opposite dichotomy. What I mean is that even people who don't know their MBTI types will naturally understand other types that share this dichotomy. So intuitives will easily connect with other intuitives, and sensors will connect with other sensors, even if they don't know their MBTI types. Of course, I'm not saying it's impossible for opposites to attract and connect. For example, both of my parents are sensors. They divorced and have both been with intuitives now for longer than they were together with each other. So, if you're an intuitive like me with sensors in your life, just try to remember that your sensors need some real world context for some of your out of this world kind of ideas because it can be hard to follow sometimes. You might have some really good ideas when your head is in the clouds, but the sensors live on Earth, so you gotta find a way to come back down and share it with them, or else they're just gonna get lost in the sauce. Show them that it's more than just an idea and you can actually turn it into something real, because I'm sure they'd love to make it happen. And if you're a sensor with intuitives in your life, just know that the intuitives really do appreciate all of your practical knowledge and street smarts because it does not come naturally to them, and it can be a bit dry sometimes. Know that the intuitives around you just have some new ideas that might sound a little improbable or idealistic sometimes, but they just want to be listened to, and if at all possible, have your help turning them into a reality. The third dichotomy we'll talk about is the difference between T and F, which stands for thinking and feeling, respectively. This dichotomy is probably the most instinctively understood compared to the others, so I don't think that we'll need to spend a lot of time going over what the differences are, but as one of the 4-letter placements, it obviously should be talked about. If the sensing-intuitive dichotomy is what we use for taking in the information around us and organizing it in meaningful ways in our brain, then the thinking-feeling dichotomy is what we use for making decisions based on the information we've collected. This is one of the most important foundations of MBTI: how we perceive and how we judge. Thinkers will prefer to use logical analysis to make unbiased, objective, rational decisions, whereas feelers prefer to use emotional intelligence to make affectionate, considerate, and moralistic decisions. That's not an exhaustive list of keywords, but hopefully it's enough to get you started with some good word association. Let it be known that the operative word here, as it is with all dichotomies, is prefer. Thinkers prefer logic, and feelers prefer emotion, but everybody is capable of using both. They just tend to be a bit less advanced in their less preferred method. Thinkers do still feel emotion and can still choose to act on their emotions to make choices, and feelers can still be objective when the situation calls for it if emotional intelligence isn't what is required for the current situation. If you're a thinker with a lot of feelers in your life, even if something is objectively correct and needs to be said, just try to remember that there is more than one way to say something, and you can, sometimes, still make all the points you want without being insensitive at the same time. Another thing to remember is that sometimes people will be more receptive to your words at different points in time. If your friend's cat died an hour ago, maybe now isn't the time to suggest that they get a new cat because they would feel less lonely. That may very well be true and potentially helpful, but they may not be ready to hear that, so maybe wait a week or two, or however long it takes for them to work through their initial raw sadness. That was a bit of an extreme and kind of morbid example, but it's mainly to help illustrate the differences here. If you're a feeler with a lot of thinkers in your life, just know that they do care for you and oftentimes express that care through trying to help you solve problems. Because how much better of a life could they offer you than a life with no problems, right? Seriously though, they do want to be there for you in their own way. It's just that they may not always understand the emotional subtext of certain situations and just need it spelled out a little bit more literally and directly for them to connect with you in the situation. It might be a little unusual to try and intellectualize how you feel about something so that the thinkers can more easily understand and digest your point of view on something. But if you can manage it enough to connect with them, they're unlikely to take major offense and should hopefully be able to better adjust their actions to avoid being unnecessarily insensitive. A healthy thinker should be just as open to communication as a healthy feeler. And the very last dichotomy for us to discuss is the difference between J and P, i.e., judging and perceiving, respectively. I think this dichotomy is actually pretty easy and straightforward to understand once you get past the descriptors judgers and perceivers. The biggest point of confusion and sometimes contention that I see with this is people who test as judgers getting upset because they think part of their personality type is that they're judgmental. In general, judgers can have a more innate propensity for being judgmental as one of their unhealthy vices. But this is definitely not the default personality trait that this dichotomy is suggesting with its name, therefore, it's kind of a misnomer. Between taking in information, aka perceiving, and making decisions based on said information, aka judging, the judgers tend to place a stronger emphasis on the importance of coming to conclusions, making decisions, and taking action to achieve goals. If you're well versed in the difference between type A and type B personalities, then you'd say they sound a lot like a type A personality because they pretty much are. If they're going on vacation, they're the ones who found the hotel and has everybody's plane tickets accounted for ahead of time before even leaving the house. Their day scheduled, their bags packed, their vacation list of activities for everyone to do existent and full. Hopefully, this paints a vivid enough picture of what a judger really is. Obviously, I'm being a little silly, and that was just a caricature, but that's the judger in a nutshell. Perceivers, on the other hand, will tend to place a stronger emphasis on the importance of gathering information for the most clear picture of a situation. It's funny to say this as a perceiver myself, but even comparing judgers and perceivers directly like this, being a judger just makes so much more sense than a perceiver on a surface level. I say that because judgers tend to be very clear with the goals they would like to achieve, whereas perceivers are, well, not. Being a perceiver is kind of like, let's get all the information about this particular subject at our own pace, and then we'll know we didn't leave out any important information. And then you could ask them, like, okay, great, so what will you do with all that information? And the perceiver would just be like, well, if any of the information becomes relevant, then we'll know that we can use it. But they don't really even know what they will use it for, if that makes sense. Like I said, judgers are much more deliberate in their goals, and that sometimes makes them even easier to describe when comparing the two. If judgers are the type A personalities, then perceivers are the type B personalities who like to go with the flow and keep their options open. Focusing on perceiving means that they can get a better sense of all the different decisions they could make before actually making them. Judgers don't care about all the decisions they could make. They only care about the best singular decision to make. To use the vacation analogy, the perceivers are the ones who probably had the idea to vacation in the first place and came up with a bunch of different places you could go to. They're the ones who aren't going to pack until the night before or even the day of departure, because if they forget to pack something, they'll just find a way to deal with it on the fly. Judgers will prevent problems from ever occurring, while perceivers accept that problems will always be there and just choose to deal with them as they show up. These are, of course, both valuable traits, and just depends on the situation for which one you need. Perceivers are more likely to be better about jumping into action and responding to sudden stimuli because they like responding to the information presented to them in real time. Whereas judgers are much more likely to be better at managing large operations and preventing problems in the first place because they like to use the information as a tool for their own decision making. And that about wraps up the 4 dichotomies for the Myers-Briggs typology indicator. It's cute and it's fun. It can help you get an idea of who you are and who other people are. You can get an idea of why you connect with certain people in your life based on the similarities in your types, or why you really don't connect with other people in your life, and how you can try to mend those disconnects. Maybe you found out for you, opposites do attract, and you actually really like people with differing dichotomies from you. Maybe you're an introvert, but your good friend is an extrovert and does all the talking at the restaurants you go to. Or maybe you're a feeler and your thinker friend can help you put constructive criticism into more technical language instead of saying something like, I don't know why, but I just don't really like this or that. Any type can appreciate any other type if they are willing to understand each other and find the beauty in the differences that make everyone unique. Which, maybe that's corny or cliche, but I don't care because it really is true. And yeah, I know there's only 16 possible types, but that doesn't mean that there are only 16 types of people in the world, which is a pretty common criticism of MBTI from people who don't really know much about it. I've met lots of other INTPs who have different ideas and opinions from me because they've had different life experiences or come from other cultures, etc., etc. Not to mention that MBTI isn't the only personality assessment out there. There are plenty of other typology indicators, which I plan to discuss in the podcast later down the line, that assess other traits in people where even two of the same MBTI type can be different types in a different assessment. Like I said at the beginning of the episode, if this is as far as you go with learning about MBTI, that is totally okay, and I'm so glad you stuck around to the end of the episode. Feel free to come back anytime to learn more if you wish, but otherwise, I hope you have fun typing yourself and others and finding new ways to connect with people based on what we talked about today. Speaking of which, if you don't know your type yet and you want to find out, I'd recommend you check out the test on 16personalities.com. It's probably the most well-known test out there, so it should be easy to find. Lots of people have problems with this particular test, and I won't say that those problems are unwarranted because I do think their criticisms are valid, and I understand where they're coming from, but again, this is all just to have fun, and it doesn't have to be that deep, so if you don't care about any of that, then just go, take the test, and have fun. I still use it to this day anyway. If you're interested in going even deeper into the Myers-Briggs typology indicator to gain an even more nuanced understanding of yourself and the important people in your life, then stick around for the next few episodes where we will talk about each of the individual types and the Jungian cognitive functions that will give more specific descriptions as to how differently people can perceive and make judgments. Things like differentiating between the two different types of thinking or feeling functions, because yes, there is more than one way to use logic or emotional intelligence to draw conclusions. If you've made it this far, thank you so much for tuning into the Myers-Briggs University podcast today. If you want more personality content before the next episode, you can support me on Patreon at patreon.com/mbuniversity. For only $5 a month, you can participate in a private group chat about all things personality with myself and other members. You'll gain access to written transcripts of all my episodes, and I'll give you a fun, personalized shout out here on the podcast. If you're not interested in monetary support, that's totally fine. You can always just leave a review on the podcast, hopefully 5 stars, to help all of the algorithms get the podcast to new people who could benefit from tuning into the episode you just listened to. You can also interact with me on socials, mainly Instagram and Tumblr, where I'll post funny memes and a wealth of additional MBTI information also. Links to those are in the description of the podcast. If you have content suggestions or MBTI-related questions that you would like me to address on the podcast, then feel free to contact me. You can text or call my Google voicemail. Don't worry, it goes straight to voicemail. I won't pick up. At 216-264-3997. Or you can email me at myersbriggsuniversity@gmail.com. I'll either play your voicemail audio or I'll read your email aloud, but either way, I will answer your questions right here on the podcast if you want. Make sure you leave your name and your personality type if you want them to be included in your question. Thank you so much for tuning in to the Myers-Briggs University podcast, and I hope you enjoyed the episode. I've been your host, Isaac, and have a great day. Until next time.